Yeah, you were making the point about critical thinking and confirmation bias and that sort of thing. But don't the critics? So I'm going to just pick your brain a bit as a science communicator, if you don't mind. Don't the critics have a point though that science and science communication has been guilty of the very flaws that they're pointing out in their critics? In other words, for example, the replication crisis in psychology. So
Mhm.
many of the central, uh, most well-known bits of research in psychology have not been replicated or have been misrepresented. I think you and I had an exchange on Substack recently about the Milgram experiment, where
Oh, that's
that's
great.
presented as this ironclad evidence of the
Mhm.
innate cruelty of human beings, and then it turns out that only a
It's a little more
fraction,
complicated than that.
yeah,
Yeah.
only a fraction of the cases that they ran have been reported. It's almost like in science how if you don't come up with interesting results, it just doesn't get
Yeah.
published. And so it seems like everything is significant. It
Right.
misrepresents reality.
I mean, I'm completely sympathetic to that concern, and I think that as science communicators, we are, um, you know, indebted to the idea of nuance and clarity and truth, um, because I think what oftentimes makes for the best story in science communication doesn't necessarily capture the complexity of, especially in psychology, which is what I write about, and human behavior. It doesn't necessarily capture um, the all of the sort of intricacies of a complicated experimental design, for instance. So the
Right.
trick is, trying to communicate effectively and clearly in a way that doesn't misrepresent the reality of the situation with the study and the complexities therein, but still make it engaging. And that's
Right.
hard. So I think a lot of writers and science communicators will just try to find the juiciest bits and focus on that. But as you say, that could be inherently misleading to the
Yeah.
audience. So I agree with you. I mean, I think that our obligation is to tell the truth, um, but not get lost in the weeds. I guess if that's
Yeah, I mean it's so difficult, right? It's the same thing in journalism and so many other areas where narrative comes into conflict with reality. If it
correct.
bleeds, it leads. So you end up with this narrative of constant danger, and everyone's afraid their kids are about to be kidnapped when the
Right.
actual incidence of kidnapping in the United States is a fraction of what it was 20 years ago when kids
Mhm.
were playing outside. Or I'm dating myself,
Right.
50 years ago when
Yeah.
kids were playing outside. So I feel like, I mean, are we, when you look at this in a global sense, do you feel that like is that a summation of what's going on here, that narrative has veered so far from objective reality that we're having a crisis uh, of seeing
Potentially,
what's
but I
real?
also think it's important to remember that it's not necessarily a deliberate sort of conspiracy maneuver by scientists or science communicators. I think that we're just as vulnerable to these psychological biases and the power of story and narrative as the audience. So I think that we see stories when
Right,
we're trying to process complex scientific data and try to
right.
communicate that in a way that will resonate with the audience, but it also reflects our own cognitive biases. So I think that to me, the best science communicators are the ones that actually have a background in science
Hmm.
and can, understand a complex methodological design and the theoretical intricacies and nuances of a study, and pay homage to that in in the write up, or in the framing of the work.
Right.
But that's where you potentially lose the audience too. So it's there's a balancing act there.
Right. Which brings us to another layer, another sort of undercurrent of bias, which is the economics of this, right? You're trying to sell books, you're trying to sell,
Right.
get
Yeah.
clicks on your YouTube video, you're trying to,
Mhm.
the whole
Yeah.
game is attracting attention, and you don't attract attention by being sober, thorough, and nuanced.
Exactly. No, yeah. It's this sort of, you push these buttons in human psychology. Um, Rage bait obviously is a very effective, powerful rhetorical tool that we
Yeah.
see all too often now. And but in doing so, we lose human nature. We lose the complexity, the nuance, the gravity of individual lives to these sort of caricatures of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And I have a problem with that, just as I would imagine you do.
Yeah. Yeah. I read, actually, I haven't read it yet. And it's interesting because I've had the tab open on my computer for about 3 months. New Yorker story about Oliver Sacks. Have you seen
Right.
this? That
I
apparent,
know of the issue and the revelations. Yes,
right. I think I'm resistant to reading it. It's certainly not the only tab I've had open for
skimmed
months,
it.
but
Yeah, I get the gist of it.
the gist of it is that he made
Not
up a
flattering.
bunch of his case studies, right?
Correct.
And
Is
he's
it that
like,
he completely fabricated them, or he elaborated on some kernel
yeah,
of truth? I,
I don't know. Like I said, I haven't been able to read it because it would be like reading that Jane Goodall was a child molester or something. It's
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
that
But even on that note, Jane Goodall,
she's in the
she was
Epstein
exposed
file.
for plagiarism.
Oh, really?
you know, yeah. I
Oh,
mean,
I didn't know
this was
that.
maybe a decade ago or so that she, you know, that there were some questionable elements of her storytelling that
Yeah.
were, arguably unethical.
Well, I even in Sex at Dawn, I when I was researching Sex at Dawn, I came up across a book by someone named Margaret Powers, I think it was, that was critiquing Goodall's experimental methodology and how,
Did she
she
have an
had,
experimental methodology?
yeah, such as it was, but she was basically publishing papers showing that the chimps in Gombe were peaceful and relaxed and, it's sort of moving in between groups and everything was cool. But it was very difficult to follow the chimps through the treetops, right? So they
Right.
started putting out food so that the chimps would come to the food and they could observe the behavior of the chimps around the food. And then that created all sorts of chaos because now there's a reliable food supply that they put out every day at the same time. So the neighboring
Sure.
groups start coming in and they're fighting over the food. And then
Yeah.
Goodall was like, oh, there's war between groups. And suddenly that's on the cover of National Geographic.
Sounds
And
like
she
Napoleon
becomes,
Chagnon or
exactly.
Margaret Reed.
It's exactly the same thing. Yeah. Let me give you machetes and then call you violent. Yeah.
Well, I mean, on that note too, like when I was a master's student in Louisiana studying under Daniel Povinelli, who was a chimpanzee researcher studying social cognition and differences between human beings and chimpanzees. He was one of the few researchers that were actually arguing that there are meaningful cognitive differences between human beings and our closest living relatives, because 7 million years has separated us in terms of common ancestry, and a lot has happened over that time. But what captures the public imagination, what you see on the cover of National Geographic, are just how similar human beings are to chimpanzees, that they're just like
Yeah.
us, these sort of watered
Yeah.
down human beings.
Well,
So nobody wants to
especially,
hear how different they are,
right.
even though
And it's
it's not a sort of moral statement or value judgment or anything like that. It's just
right.
evolutionary diversity.
Yeah. And especially that argument is used when it reinforces the neo-Hobbesian narrative of human nature, right?
Right. Yeah.
War, rape, all this aggression goes
Yeah.
back to our chimpanzee ancestors.
Yeah.
But
Nobody's denying that we're not animal. Of course, we're biological organisms. We're animals
right.
just like chimpanzees, but
But let's talk about bonobos. What the fuck?
exactly. Yeah.
Like it frustrates me so much because it's such an obvious
And do we
example
really
of,
want to be like bonobos in terms of our sexuality? Because there are a lot of questionable things that bonobos do that would not work well in terms of human behavior.
well,
So,
yeah, we've got, taboos. I mean, there's
well,
definitely,
more
but
than taboos.
well, I mean, there are different issues here. I'm not saying we need we should be like bonobos. What I am saying is if you're going to make an argument that using chimpanzees as evidence of innate human murderousness,
Yeah,
then you need to include the equally relevant example of bonobos who until recently have never been witnessed to murder another bonobo in captivity or in the wild.
sure.
So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, you can't say, and this phrase of chimpanzees are closest primate relative, and they don't mention bonobos. It's like it's so obviously pushing a propaganda argument as opposed to a balanced scientific look at something. So,
Right.
I mean, I don't want to rant about that too much, but yeah, bonobo sexuality is quite interesting. It's the mother son is the only combination that doesn't fornicate, which
Mhm.
suggests to me that motherfucker is the oldest, uh, offensive term that predates
Mhm.
language, even,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't include that in my TED talk, but I
Deep-seated,
should have.
biologically based aversion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, following up on this line of to be an effective science communicator, you want to obviously you want to communicate in a way that's effective. You need to know how to tell a story. You need to know what to leave in, what to leave out, uh,
Not be
but
boring, but
not be
also do
boring.
justice to the complexity. Yeah.
But also choose your subject matter
Mhm.
strategically, which you have certainly done. If we look at your list of books, each one of them is about something that people are always going to be interested in.
And that's not going away. Yes.
Right, yeah, right. It's evergreen, right? Like, is there God? Is God biological or spiritual or whatever? Perversion, sexuality, and how it gets diverted into other things.
Suicide.
Suicide, exactly. Right. Yeah. I mean, these are all hot topics. I mean, do you go into them thinking? And maybe this is a not a good question to ask you. This is from one writer to another kind of thing. But like, do you think of the books in terms of their commercial potential when you're getting into it, or
Honestly,
is it
no. I mean,
just what you're
I mean,
into?
I think when I think that's a natural conversation that you have with publishers and agents,
Right.
and in terms of market appeal and where it would fit in the current uh, climate and that sort of thing. But no, I mean, I'm attracted to topics that are just inherent. I think that are just inherently big, juicy, existential
Right.
issues that have always appealed to me, and have motivated me to dig deeper. And I can really sort of commit myself to over the course of writing a book, which is, as a very elongated, involved process of up to 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's dedicating a substantial amount of your own life and personal time to something that has to resonate with you at a deep emotional level.
Yeah. Yeah. So as the author of
So in other words,
Perv,
it's not just to sell books or trying to
yeah,
sell
yeah.
books.
No, I
Like,
got you. Yeah,
I want
I
people to read what
agree.
I write, but also I find these things inherently interesting.
Yeah, you don't want to spend years. I mean, when I was looking at, trying to figure out my doctoral dissertation, I was a year into research on something that was very interesting and very important. And, you know, I really believed it was research that needed to be done, but it didn't fascinate me.
Yeah.
And then I stumbled into, what later became Sex at Dawn, and that fascinated me. Like, I
Yeah, I
want
think
to
we have a
be an
lot in
expert on
common with
this.
that,
Yeah,
those types of things. I'd always been interested in, I guess for lack of a better word, existential topics.
right.
I was always attracted to, obscure French existential literature, for instance, and
Mm,
meaninglessness and purpose. And as I was, uh, reading that literature, I was studying evolutionary science, and it was trying to kind of marry those really humanitarian interest about what it means to be a human being
yeah.
without God and without purpose, and trying to make sense of things in a way that allowed me to live without the illusion of intelligent design or agency, and these types of questions.
Yeah. As the author of Perv, I can't lose the opportunity to ask you your impressions of what's going on in the world right now, the whole Epstein
Yeah.
situation,
Well, I can't imagine
pedophilia.
having written the book now. I think it's a very different time.
Huh.
Um,
You think why? Why wouldn't you write it now?
well, I would write it now, but I think it would have been received very differently
Hmm.
now. Um, just because I think, perhaps rightly, it's a sort of reckoning about human behavior and sexuality, but it also reveals these lingering unresolved tensions about being a sexual human organism, and trying to navigate constantly changing moral waters.
Hmm.
And um, the biology, our inherent biology doesn't change, and sort of our evolutionary ancestry and mechanisms lending themselves to different paraphilias and fetishes and forms of sexual deviance. But the cultural climate, the atmosphere changes, and I think the conversations that we have are very different as a result.
Right.
So I think it's just a reflection of the unresolved nature of coming to grips with our own sexuality.
Do you see this whole pedophilia thing and and what happened to the Catholic Church, for example? Do you see these behaviors as primarily sexual, or are they primarily about shame, or are they primarily about being above the rules that everyone else lives by? Like, how do you?
Well, I would say all of the above. I mean,
Hmm.
um, sexual deviance and perversions, and especially the darker aspects of those types of things like pedophilia and rape and um, you know elder abuse, and horrible things that writing about the science of sexual deviance unfortunately have to get into.
Right.
Those things do have, for better or worse, a sexual component associated with them. People have to be sexually aroused by these things um, to indulge in these completely unacceptable, immoral, illegal behaviors. So part of my task as a sort of scientist writing about these phenomena is to better understand them, so we can have frank, serious conversations rather than just screaming and shouting and sort of this moralistic dialogue.
Yeah.
So you can't stop it unless you understand it.
Right. So, do you think I was speaking with a friend about this recently, and she said to me, her question was, look, if I did all the work, if I did all the kind of cleansing psychological, therapy and talked about whatever traumas I had as a child or whatever guilt and shame and whatever, and if I
Mhm.
worked through all of that and I came out on the other side, would I have would sex be juicy, or would it just be totally missionary position, I'm going to sleep?
Right.
In other
No,
words,
I mean, I think that's a very insightful point. I think putting sex under the microscope, the sort of reductionist understanding of the um, biological mechanisms and psychological processes, and thinking in this, it's not inherently sexy. It's not erotic to sort of think of
it's
sex from a
anti-erotic.
yeah, and I think that sort of ambiguity, the mystery, the abstractedness of sexuality does give it that erotic power. Um, but when we're thinking about deviance, especially, the Epstein sort of type of behaviors, uh, we can't indulge in those. You can't indulge in the mystery. You really have to understand it to prevent it happening. And I think that that's a good thing to sort of understand the mechanics of it, because that does strip away the any sort of erotic element of it. It
Right,
throws
but
cold
are
water.
we really understanding it if we strip away any erotic element of it? I mean, isn't the essence of it erotic in some ways?
Well, the deeper you dig into the mechanics and the sort of the how to and whys, it it loses its appeal, and that's a good thing when we're talking about things like sexual coercion, rape, pedophilia, all the horrible things of human sexuality.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated thing. I mean, I imagine a priest and a nun who decide to sneak out into the woods and fuck. And
Right.
I'm thinking that must be horrible, but
And
also
probably a pretty rare event, I would imagine. But yes.
I don't know how rare. I mean, they found these lakes in Italy, next to nunneries from the medieval period, full of baby skeletons, hundreds of them. You
Right,
know,
but those are mostly girls that have been in the convent, that have been pregnant and been
yeah,
discarded.
yeah,
Not necessarily the offspring of the nuns, but who knows? I mean, who knows?
yeah, yeah. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. I was raised outside of any religious tradition, so I don't have that kind of shame. And so
Yeah.
I kind of wonder. Um,
Well, so was I, but I still. I mean, I mean, I guess I'm gay, so I think that there's. I still definitely felt the shame of sex and having a minority
was
sexual
it
orientation.
hot? Was it hot when you were torn up over it, and then get less hot as you worked through the shame?
Kind of, yeah. Actually, to be honest,
That's what I'm
the less
afraid
I
of.
knew about it, the more sexualized and hotter it was, I think. Yeah.
Right, right. It's prohibited, right? I mean, that's kind of hot. Yeah,
But of
yeah,
course, I also got older as I understood it at that level too. So
right.
it's conflated with that.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about reincarnation.
Natural
An-
segue, yes.
Maybe in my next life, I want to be gay. I'll tell you. I feel like I've been
Well,
gay adjacent my whole
why
life.
wait?
My because it's just not there, man. Believe me, I've looked for it.
Keep
My
trying.
partner's father is gay, and
Uh huh.
it's like, man, if I had known what I've been looking for my whole life is a woman raised by a gay man because I'm
Yeah, that's
like, I'm a gay straight guy or a straight gay guy. I'm not sure.
right.
I kind of relate to like most of my best friends have been gay, and I know I
Was he,
sound like
is
the
your partner's husband, or sorry, your partner's husband, your partner's father a late in life gay? Like came out late?
he was, it depends what you call coming out, but his story was he moved to New York City when he was 19 or something. He saw himself as bi at that point, but he was working in theater, and it was the early, late 70s, early 80s, and so AIDS was just sort of,
Yeah, just before AIDS,
yeah,
yeah, hit.
and he wanted a deeper connection. He wanted a relationship, and the men he was meeting were all just like looking for quick and
Hookups.
dirty. Yeah. But he wanted something deeper, and he found a woman that knew that he was very open with about his sexuality, and she was okay with it, and they had two kids. And during the process, he kind of realized, like, I'm not bi, I'm gay. Like, you
Yeah, I
know,
can sympathize with that. I mean, I would definitely
yeah.
say I've fallen in love with women. I think, some of my closest relationships have been with women, but I'm just
Hmm.
not sexually attracted to them.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but I get that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've fallen in love with men, with,
Well, let's
my
not
gay
let's not
friends.
reveal our love life here, Chris. No, just
No,
kidding.
we should. Oh, between us, yeah.
You and I.
It's a long distance relationship.
Right, right.
Um, but I've been interested in Ian Stevenson's work for so long. Such an enigmatic character. I tried reading, what is it, 20 Cases of Suggestive Reincarnation?
20 cases suggestive of reincarnation,
Oh,
yes.
suggestive of reincarnation.
Right.
One of the most boring books
Yes, yeah.
about a fascinating topic. Talk about a bad science communicator. It's almost
Well,
like
it
he
was
did it
deliberate. It was
intentionally. Yeah,
deliberately
okay.
boring because he
Right.
was trying to write for a medical audience. His
Yeah.
books in his mind were medical treatises on reincarnation.
Right.
And he wanted he didn't want it to be sensationalistic. He didn't want to talk to the public. He wanted to talk to his academic scientific peers to legitimize the subject matter.
Right.
So
Did that
so yeah,
succeed? Did
sorry.
did did his peers read his work?
Not many. I mean, it depends on
Yeah.
what you not the peers that he wanted to read it. So he wanted serious psychiatrists and biologists and developmentalists to take his arguments for the scientific basis of reincarnation seriously. But it it was only read really, especially in his time, by fellow parapsychologists, people who already believed in these phenomena. So he was roundly ignored by
Yeah.
the people that he wanted to appreciate his work the most.
Right. So what led you to this subject, to his work?
So, despite my work in science communication and writing a lot about sex and suicide and God and all these types of things, my own research program, in terms of my laboratory research, was on people's reasoning and beliefs about the afterlife. So, going way back to my PhD, for instance, I studied people's intuitive conceptions of the continuity of the mind after biological death. I, did studies with children, looking at how they differ as a consequence of cognitive developmental stages, about reasoning about the afterlife. One of the biggest takeaways from that early work was that the younger the child, 3 and 4 year olds, basically, the more likely they were to say that mental states survived biological death. So emotions and intentions and perceptual states compared to older kids who presumably had acquired more scientific knowledge and more understanding between the relationship, at least the material relationship between the mind and the brain. And that was kind of shocking at the time because people just assumed that belief in the afterlife was a byproduct of religious indoctrination or what children had been taught or exposed to culturally. But my argument, and these data have been replicated cross-culturally now, suggested that those data suggested that there's an innate component to afterlife beliefs, that this is our cognitive default. It's hard to imagine this cessation of consciousness after death. Anyway, I've done lots of research with adults, for instance, about afterlife beliefs. I did some early studies where we put college students in a room and told them that it was haunted, that there was a ghost of a graduate student who had designed the study that presumably had been seen in the room, and we looked at the participants' behavior when they thought the ghost was in the room versus a control condition where they heard nothing about the ghost, and we found that those students who were told there was a ghost in the room were less likely to cheat on a task when it was very tempting. So this sort of watchful supernatural agent in the room seemed to inhibit people's transgressive social behaviors.
Santa Claus. Yeah.
It's the Santa Claus effect for sure. So I go way back with my research, these laboratory experiments about afterlife beliefs, basically, and how people think about the fate of our consciousness or our mind after death. And I'd always viewed these phenomena through a very skeptical materialist lens, that these are cognitive illusions, that we have a hard time understanding that when you're dead, that's it. Because it's not terribly controversial in cognitive neuroscience, for instance, to say that the brain is responsible for even the slightest twinge of phenomenological experience, consciousness. Take that away, take the brain away. What do you have nothing. But then I started. So I've been a non-believer, a fairly hard-nosed skeptic for a very long time, and still lean. I should say I still lean in that direction. But in working on this new book, my intention was to write a book that was fairly in line with that sentiment, that this is all a cognitive illusion. I'm trying to explain, our weird cognitive penchant for assuming that the mind survives death. But in writing the book proposal and sort of organizing myself for this task, I started reading some of the parapsychology, or at least what I would consider the better parapsychology. And Ian Stevenson is at the top of that echelon of good, theoretically informed, smart parapsychological science. So I found myself thinking, all right, I'm trying to explain this away, but yet there are these cases that I can't explain through these cognitive biases and psychological mechanisms that I'm familiar with. So the book became basically an attempt to reconcile my work as a psychologist who studies people's belief in the afterlife and why we're so vulnerable to them with these parapsychological findings that I can't explain, but somehow I have to grapple with. And their mission was not to explain the psychology, but to basically answer the question of whether there is an afterlife or whether the mind does survive death. And that took me on this journey basically through the story, the life, career, incredibly fascinating times of Ian Stevenson.
And what cases of his, or what research of his, is most disconcerting to you?
The most challenging, I would say, are some, not all of his cases of children's memories of previous lives, where they're giving very idiosyncratic, detailed descriptions of a life before they were born that
Right.
matches a person that is that verifiably existed, that the families had no interaction with before. No, they didn't cross paths, they didn't exchange information, but somehow the child, who's often 3, 4 years old, is sharing detailed facts, seemingly unbidden of their own accord, that matches the description of the life of somebody that lived 3 or 4 that died 3 or 4 years, say, before they were born.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
remember details
yeah,
like I worked in a brick factory and I had two sisters and a brother, and my sister was
often given
married.
names, yeah,
Names, exactly. And they had
and
a
names of
dog.
villages and towns, and
Right. And so they could track down the family and find the people that the family that this little kid is describing. And did
correct.
they bring the child to the house of the family and the child
Occasionally,
recognized the people?
there were a handful of cases, not many. I mean, he'd had thousands of cases, and most of them, I have to say, were not that compelling. But
Yeah.
there were some cases where, for instance, he would arrive on the scene before the two families had ever met, and he would take the child to this other place that the child had identified, and they would interrogate the child sort of on site while he was there. And sometimes, it was, they had autopsy records of photographs of the dead body, medical reports. And the most convincing cases, at least Ian Stevenson, I guess to me too, was when the kid not only had these memories, these idiosyncratic um, memories about the previous life, but also had a physical sign like a birth defect or a
Right.
birthmark that
Right.
that usually matched the fatal injuries of the person that had died.
Right.
So, the kid had some weird birthmark that, like on the chest, that looked like, um, you know, what do you call it? The gunshot residue,
Mm.
or it's a sort of patterned mark on the chest that
Right.
matched an autopsy record of the guy that died being shot with a shotgun, in the chest. Things like that, or kid with missing digits on one hand that matched the injuries that the previous personality, and Stevenson called it the dead person, another kid, got his hand stuck in a farm, a piece of farm equipment, and lost all of his fingers. So he was very sort of interested in these physical cases, I guess, and this is why he talked quite often about the sort of these medical models of reincarnation.
Yeah. He How did he find these kids? Did he have a network of graduate students?
He he had, as the years went on, he had expanding networks of, you know, informants, he would call them, on the ground, who would bring to his attention these episodes where a child in a village, for instance, would seemingly be recalling the life of somebody who lived before. And then Ian Stevenson typically would either send one of his trained researchers to do the interviews in person, or he would fly there himself and do them.
Mm.
Um, and it's not a perfect system, and I should say that some critics have suggested that, well, they were just, these informants were being paid, so maybe they were just, they were sort of drip feeding this information to the child, and there was this whole
Mm.
conspiracy theory. And but I don't think there's any strong evidence for that. And Ian Stevenson was perfectly aware of those accusations, and I think he was quite preemptive in addressing them. He he really um, he really sort of took this approach where offense was the best defense. So he would basically try to disprove as much as he can all of these things through more parsimonious explanations, and try to exhaust the list of more
Mm.
simplistic, naturalistic explanations. And he would only arrive at the reincarnation interpretation once all those other things had been eliminated, point
Right.
by point.
Right. So, and most of these,
What was so compelling to me
go ahead.
about him was
Yeah.
that he was not your stereotypical paranormal investigator. I think when we think
Yeah.
of that term, we conjure up, ghost hunters or some, really eccentric figure in physics or whatever. But he was a classically trained, you know, psychiatrist, a very prominent figure. He was the head of the psychiatry and neurology department at the University of Virginia. He'd written textbooks on interviewing techniques, forensic interviewing techniques. He was not a dumb guy. He was a very careful methodologist. And that gave, to me, a little bit more credence to the cases that he presented.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of the cases were India, Lebanon, and Brazil. Is that correct?
Southeast Asia,
Oh,
yeah, and then there's areas as well. And that was
right.
another criticism that, well, of course, you're going to find these accounts of reincarnation in places where reincarnation is a popular belief system.
Right,
But
but that makes total sense, right? If you're telling kids they're crazy, then they're not going to report
well,
these
that
sorts
was
of
his argument too,
experiences.
that in these cultures, adults actually took them seriously and they listened to them and they allowed them to share this information.
Right.
Whereas, typically in the West and the US and Europe, kids start talking about these types of things. It's just nonsense. You just don't even listen to them, don't pay attention to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And generally, the cases, if I remember correctly, were of people who died violently, unexpectedly at a young age. These weren't people in their 90s who faded away, right? They were generally young people with a
Correct. Yeah.
family. Yeah.
which which maps onto his early work, which is in psychosomatic medicine, and he thought that emotions were very powerful elements of human psychology because they transformed bodily systems too. So in some of his early
Mm.
work before he became a parapsychologist, he looked at how just simply talking or thinking about distressing life events. So you have a patient, for instance, who's in the examining room and they're thinking about their you know abusive mother or child who's a juvenile delinquent or their money problems, things like that. It actually has physical effects on them, so their heart rate changes, or some
Hmm.
of the studies suggested that the just thinking about a distressing life event would change the shape, the color, the texture of your organs. So your colon would actually change
Mm.
just based on a distressing thought. So this was all connected with his reincarnation work, but because he thought that somehow something similar like that is happening when you die a very painful death in the throes of agony, that that gestationally as an embryo somehow that affects your physical development and your shape as well. So this explains the sort of birth defects and birthmarks and that sort of thing with injuries that map onto the cause of death.
So the fetus is in a psychological state that's affecting its development in utero.
Yeah, and the greatest omission with his work is that he didn't really have a coherent theoretical explanation for the mechanism by which this would actually. He
Right.
thought somehow it happened, but
Right.
couldn't explain how it happened. That
Well, I mean, isn't that a great, getting back to our earlier conversation about the limits of science? There's an essay called The Myth of Mechanism that I often refer to, where I forget who wrote it, but the scientist was saying, like, there's this assumption that we need to be able to explain how something happens in order for our observation that it happens to be considered legitimate. And that's
right.
nonsense. Things have, observational science has been around for a very long time, and you know the permutations of that Galileo observed in the Saturn or whatever it was, like he didn't have to explain how that was happening. He just had to
Right.
note that it was happening and that it was
Because it doesn't
predictable.
conform with existing theoretical models, and
Right.
but that reveals that something's wrong with the contemporary theories. So,
Exactly. And that's no reason to discard the observation simply because we don't know how it happens.
yeah.
So we
Which
don't.
is what Ian Stevenson argued, that the data should come first. That
Right.
if we've got anomalous phenomena happening that shouldn't be happening, if the sort of materialist worldview is correct or the dominant theoretical framework is correct, then these things shouldn't be happening at all. But the fact that they are, according to his data, suggests that we're missing something and we've got to revise the contemporary model. Whether you're convinced by his evidence or not is a different question. I
Right.
think, and this is also important too, because he never argued that his work proved reincarnation. He thought that the data were strong enough to, in his words, suggest reincarnation, and that
Right.
a rational, empirically grounded individual can look at his cases and come to the conclusion that reincarnation is real. Um, but he never said that there was ever a perfect case.
Right. Have you had experiences personally that are inexplicable according to your understanding of the universe?
I've had a number of anomalous events, and I talk about them a bit in the book. None of them have been, super dramatic or life changing, but they've been strange enough to give me pause and, maybe give more license to the arguments that people like Ian Stevenson were attempting to make.
Hmm.
So, um, for instance, are you looking for examples?
Sure,
Are you-
sure.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's nothing terribly dramatic, but I remember quite clearly when I was about 19 or 20. I was living in Florida at the time, going to university. My father was in Ohio, but he was visiting Florida on a business trip, and we were staying in a hotel that night. And um, I had a dream in the hotel room where there was a knock on the door of the hotel, and it was very vivid, almost as though it was real life. And I got up out of bed in the dream sequence, opened the door, and standing at the door was this woman who I recognized as my mother's good friend, Sally. And she
Hmm.
was completely distraught, crying, um, you know, really upset. And I said, Sally, what is it? What's wrong? And she said something to the effect of, it's Blaze, which was her dog. I feel like I've looked everywhere. I can't find him. I've looked everywhere around. I can't find him. I'm so upset. Something like that. And it was so weird that the next morning I actually shared that with my dad. I had this really weird dream of Sally, of all people, knocking on the hotel room door, saying this weird thing about her golden retriever, her dog Blaze. And my dad's like, "Oh, that's weird," And then I went home that very afternoon. I was living at my mother's house at that time, and um, the phone rang, and this is in real life, and it was Sally on the phone, and she was crying. And I said, "What's wrong, Sally?" She said, "It's Blaze. He's he's died. I feel like he should be somewhere. I can't find him in the house. I'm so used to having him in the house, but I can't find him anywhere." It was almost like the verbatim words that I had heard in the dream before.
Wow.
So, like I said, it's not there are plausible natural explanations for something like that. I mean, the skeptic would, of course, say, well, you have all these dreams. It's just the sort of nocturnal detritus of our lives, and occasionally
Hmm.
you'll have a dream that maps on to
Right.
reality. But it was the specificity of her words and the timing
Yeah.
that really resonated with me.
Right. Right. And also someone you're not generally dreaming about.
Never, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
With words like that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I'm coughing. I'm gonna have to go through and edit out all these coughs. I've got a pretty
I didn't
bad.
even notice.
You didn't notice? Oh, okay,
No.
good. Well, maybe I won't. Jesse, what's the name of the book?
The Incredible Afterlives of Dr. Stevenson.
Incredible Afterlives. So, why that title? What afterlives? After what?
Well, it wasn't just reincarnation that he was studying. I mean, he's best known for his work on children's memories of previous lives, but he also had very detailed case studies of apparitions and
Hmm.
poltergeists, telepathy. Um, he really had a much more expansive portfolio of paranormal investigations and cases than people are aware of. And I think, they might have heard things through the grapevine. They might have read his incredibly misleading, superficial treatment on Wikipedia. But the real story is much more interesting and complicated. and revealing than
Mm.
I think people are aware of. And I see him as like a the paranormality of the cases is one thing, but I see him as, to me, this was the good story. He was this sort of really colorful, important character in the history of science that we don't quite know what to do with because his data didn't fit.
Yeah.
And he was really going against the grain. So in the end, I kind of saw him as like, I don't know what to do with him. Like, is he this sort of Don Quixote character where he was seeing things that didn't exist and trying to make these elaborate cases to this sort of like funhouse mirror type of argumentation? Or was he like this Galileo figure that people haven't appreciated and recognized in terms of the significance of his work?
Right.
So it's just telling a story and leaving the reader to their own conclusions about the convincingness of his cases.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also in telling the story, I imagine one of the challenges is to convey to people, to convey to the reader that the 70s, the early 70s, late 60s, into the 80s probably was a very different cultural context. Parapsychology was taken quite seriously, far more
Yeah.
than it is now.
Especially in the 50s and 60s when you had people like J.B. Ryan at Duke University doing
Oh
experimental
yeah,
studies and so on.
right, right. Yeah,
But that was one of Ian Stevenson's major sticking points that over the years it became increasingly exploited by the entertainment industry and
right,
sensationalized, and
right.
the legitimacy of the field as a scientific discipline fell entirely to the wayside, largely
Mm,
because of that. People can't take it seriously anymore because now the term itself is so loaded.
right. Yeah, I studied in graduate school with Stanley Krippner, who knew
Yeah, yeah,
Ian Stevenson, and uh, Stanley's a very interesting character because I've been to many conferences with him over the years, and he seems to. I've been told by people that he's the only living character who's respected both by the Michael Shermer rationalist skeptical crowd and the psychic healer crowd. That
I'll
he
be talking to
takes
Michael
the
Shermer soon.
yeah,
Ian
I've
Stevenson, yeah.
I met him years ago with Stanley actually at a conference in Portugal, and yeah, it's interesting because both camps are very sort of dug in to their belief systems, and
Right.
Stanley just sort of dances between the two worlds very
Yeah.
fluidly and without any kind of investment in who's right or who's wrong.
I think, Ian Stevenson was kind of among that ilk as well. He definitely had his own personal beliefs, but
Yeah,
he at least was very aware and cognizant of the materialist counterpoints.
yeah, yeah, and he was, as you said, he was very prominent in the world of rational scientific reasoning, and he certainly wasn't going to risk his reputation any more than he needed to just by looking into this stuff. So he was
Right.
doing it in a very solid, dry,
Rigorous.
sober
Yeah.
way. Yeah,
And he
yeah,
had no interest and a very strong aversion to, writing, popular books and,
right.
selling the film rights to his cases and things like that that would somehow cheapen the seriousness of what he saw as this important question of whether we survive death, which I
Yeah,
think is incredibly admirable.
yeah, I agree. I agree. Stanley was a different character. Stanley was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and the
Wow.
amazing Kreskin.
Oh, right.
And he was like the consultant when they brought him on and they were like, okay, is this real? How can we set this up so that if Kreskin is full of shit, we'll expose it?
What
And
about Yuri
Stanley,
Geller, the spoon bending guy?
oh yeah, he knew Yuri Geller. Stanley's Rolodex is amazing, man. It
I'd
like
imagine.
literally amazing. He had the amazing Randy and the amazing Kreskin, like right next to each other in his Rolodex.
Hmm. So he did know Ian Stevenson, you said, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah. He worked with J.B. Ryan, who you mentioned
Wow.
a minute ago. I think when Stanley was like a graduate student or undergrad or something, he went and
Living
studied with
legend.
J.B. Ryan. Yeah, Yeah, he knew all these guys, and he cavorted with the Grateful Dead, and he was there. He tripped. He took LSD with Timothy Leary.
Oh, the other interesting about Ian Stevenson was that he was a pioneer with the early LSD psychedelic mescaline research.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
and that was almost the pathway that led him into parapsychology, because when he was doing this was before Timothy Leary. He was
Yeah.
doing controlled, what he called experimental psychedelics in his laboratory when he was in Louisiana in New Orleans. And um, not only did he interview people who were tripping to sort of try to get a glimpse of that state, but he also took the drugs himself, and he
Mm.
thought that he had glimpses or images of a previous life while he was on LSD, for instance, and that kind of helped open the door for these more stringent investigations later, where he went on these case studies and started studying reincarnation.